Thank you, Steve. The reason that I wanted Steve to share that story is some of you will remember about a year and a half ago, I went around and interviewed everybody at the church and talked about what do we need to focus on, what are our strengths, and what are your best memories of the church. And when I sat down with Steve, he told me that story, and he said, and I quote, I remember because I wrote it down, he said, that was when our church was at its best. We have a heritage of prayer. And in at least Steve's opinion, and at least for one person, that is the moment when our church is most who we are. And I think that right now is a time when we really need to cling to prayer. And we need to grab onto this heritage that we have that stretches back 20 odd years ago. Unfortunately, prayer is really hard. You know, I saw a video a while ago of a guy that had built this bicycle that when you would turn it to the left, the wheel would turn to the right. And when you turned it to the right, the wheel would turn to the left. And as you might imagine, this is really unnatural and uncomfortable, and it takes a bit of relearning. So he would take this bike all over the country, and he would speak at schools and talk about the way that patterns form in our brains. And he would offer people $100 if they could ride this bicycle 10 feet across the stage. And of course, nobody could ever do it. And he had to practice and practice and practice. And eventually he was able, he said one day it just clicked, and he was able to ride this bicycle that would turn backwards. But it's very unnatural. And I think that's kind of what prayer is. Prayer is unnatural for us. There's a story in Luke chapter 11 where Jesus has just been praying, and he comes back and his disciples find him and they say, Lord, teach us to pray. Because prayer is a learned behavior. Prayer isn't something that comes naturally. It's not something you just know how to do. It takes discipline and it takes practice. And so prayer is hard because it doesn't come to us the way that it's not like breathing. You know, it's difficult for us. But I think that right now God has given us an enormous opportunity to grow in our own spiritual practice. And I think this is a good time to learn to form a new habit of prayer. If you don't have a habit of prayer, I think this is a great time for us to expand and to explore if we already have a habit of prayer, and to sort of cultivate that and to get even stronger in it. But if you decide, I'm going to learn about prayer. Maybe you're not a person who prays very often, and so you're thinking, I'm going to form a habit. And so you go to the bookstore, and you're going to get yourself a book on prayer. It is paralyzing how much material there is on prayer. How many books there are that come from all different perspectives about what the purpose of prayer is and how you're supposed to do it. You have books that'll walk through the Lord's Prayer. You have books that'll walk through the Psalms. You have devotional guides. You have prayer journals. There's so much, and it's kind of like, where do you start? It's kind of hard to get your footing. Prayer is hard because we have other things to do. Whether that's at work or that's at home, we have our to-do lists. And when you have a lot on your to-do list, prayer, we would never say this, but frankly, prayer just feels like a waste of time. It feels like, I only have so many waking hours, and you want me to spend time where I just sit and do nothing and just talk with God, and that's less time for me to do the things that I need to get done. In Luke chapter 10, which, just before the disciples come and say, teach us to pray, there's this moment where Jesus goes to the house of Mary and Martha. And some of you are familiar with this story, I know. And Martha is the one, she seems to be the older sister. I'm not sure if we're told she's the older sister, but she feels like an older sister. And she's running around trying to get the table prepared and get the food all ready. And she's got her to-do list. And Mary is just sitting there at the feet of Jesus. And Martha is just indignant. And she says, Jesus, tell her to come help me. Because when you've got a to-do list sitting at the feet of Jesus, we just don't have time for that. And maybe you've been telling yourself for a while that when you do have a little more time, you're going to really work on cultivating more prayer. Or you think, man, if I just had a little more time, then I would really be able to get into this. And I know that some of us, we've had more work than we know what to do with, and we've had even less time than we did before. But for others of us, we have an abundance of time. And so my question is, if we have this abundance of time, then has that led to an increase in prayer? Have we used that to finally get around to cultivating a deeper and stronger habit of prayer? And maybe so. Maybe you have in the last 5 or 6 weeks really dug into prayer, but maybe prayer has kind of fallen by the wayside. I want to share a passage with you from Isaiah chapter 6. This is just such a powerful story, and it's only the first part of the story. It goes on, but Isaiah says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.' And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, 'Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts.'" So this is the story of Isaiah's call to be a prophet. And he sees God. He's in the temple, and he sees God's lower half. God's upper half is in the heavens, and his lower half is in the temple. And when he sees the glory of God, and he hears the burning ones who are chanting about how holy God is, and the whole place is filled with smoke, his reaction to seeing God is not, "This is amazing, and I need to go tell all my friends, and this is so cool." His reaction is, "I am ruined." He is devastated to be in the presence of God, because seeing the Holy One only puts the emphasis on his own sinfulness. He becomes more aware of how unworthy he is when he's in the presence of the Holy One. And I think that's how prayer is. I think the reason we find prayer hard is not that it's unnatural, like a backwards bike, and it's not that we don't have the time, because even when we have the time, it doesn't necessarily get allocated to prayer. I think the reason that prayer is difficult for us is that if we stop for just a second and take seriously the fact that we are in the presence of the Holy One, the almighty maker of heaven and earth, then we become all the more aware of our own sinfulness and our own unworthiness. So here's been my experience with prayer, and you can see if you relate to this. When I pause to pray, not just saying table grace and not just throwing up a flare prayer, "I really need your help with this." But when I sit down, I'm pausing to really spend some time in prayer. I all of a sudden develop a spiritual ADD, and I cannot focus on anything. I start thinking about the things that I have to do that day, the phone calls that I have to make, the phone calls that I had yesterday and how it didn't go so well, or I have a particular conversation that I need to have and I'm not really looking forward to that, or things that I'm feeling in my own body, like my back is sore, or something like that. And just anything except for prayer is what I focus on. My brain is like a pinball in a pinball machine that is just bouncing around. Prayer exposes something about the human condition. Something is wrong with us. It's not that we just slip up from time to time, that we are basically otherwise good people, and we just have these moments of poor decision making, and so we slip up, and we would have been fine except for that one Thursday where I made a mistake, and now got to go to hell. The thing about humans is we have this repulsion against God. It's like if you take 2 magnets that don't want to be in contact, and when you bring them close together, you feel the resistance. That's what our hearts do in prayer, that we just resist being in the presence of the Almighty. Prayer exposes an unruliness in us. Katie and I went to the rodeo last year up at the Chaffee County Fairgrounds, and we were watching I don't know what you call it, the Bronco riding event. It's where they get these schmucks to sit on a horse that is irate and is jumping back and forth and trying to get this guy off of its back. And the goal is just to hold on for as long as he possibly can. And there was people do this for fun. I don't know. Anyway, there's one guy that got bucked off in about 2 seconds. And it is a miracle he wasn't killed, because he fell underneath the horse as it was jumping back and forth between its front and hind legs. There were probably 5 or 6 times that he didn't get stepped on. It was amazing. But this horse, they could not get it. They tried to go lasso its neck and corral it in, and they couldn't. And this horse jumped the barrier and went into a crowd of cowboys. And you're talking guys who this is what they do for a living, right? They do this all the time, and it took them 10 minutes, a crowd of cowboys, 10 minutes to get this horse under control, because it's just going berserk. That, I think, is what prayer is like, that our hearts just get berserk when we pause to pray. Our heart is full of noise. There's this cacophony of tasks and burdens and emotions and plans and anything that we can think of to distract us. Our hearts are restless. I like the word restless. I think that, at least for me, that's an apt description of my own experience in prayer. So there's this story in Mark chapter 1 where Jesus goes off to pray. And it says, this is starting in verse 35, "Rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon, and those who were with him, searched for him, and they found him, and they said to him, 'Everyone is looking for you.' And he said to them, 'Let's go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that's why I came out.' And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons." Now, if you have ever paid attention to the prayer habits of Jesus, and maybe you haven't, but if you ever just stop and look at the way that Jesus prays, it's remarkable how much time Jesus spends in prayer, because you think he's only got 2 or 3 years to do all of his ministry, all of the miracles, all of the teaching, all of his sermons and parables and healings and casting out demons and all of his travel. It all fits into about 2 to 3 years. He's a busy guy. In fact, if you go to Mark 1, just the story before, he had been up into the wee hours of the night healing people and casting out demons. He's got a lot on his plate. And so we kind of expect that when he prays, that this restlessness would come up in him too. And that he would be that bucking bronco, that magnetic repulsion, and that it's going to be just as hard for him to pray. But instead, when he prays, it seems that he comes away with more clarity and more decisiveness and more focus. And they say, "Hey, everybody's looking for you. There's more healing to be done. There's more demon casting to be done." And he says, "We need to move on." Because he knows what he's about. He remembers what he's here to do. Prayer has given him a sense of clarity about his purpose. That's not what prayer tends to do for most of us, I think. Prayer is more difficult for us. For Jesus, prayer brings rest, not restlessness. Now, here's what I think is going on. And I can't think of any better way to say it than just to steal the words of Augustine, who wrote in the 5th century, I think, maybe the 6th. That this is the opening words of Augustine's book, The Confessions. "Great are you, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Great is your power, and of your wisdom there is no end. And man, being a part of your creation, desires to praise you. Man, who bears about with him his mortality, the witness of his sin, even the witness that you resist the proud. Yet man, this part of your creation, desires to praise you. You move us to delight in praising you, for you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." So we were made to enjoy communion with God. We're made to enjoy intimacy with God. And when we don't have that communion, that's where our restlessness begins. Restlessness doesn't come from the conversations we need to have and the things on our to-do list or even from our own sinful nature. Our restlessness comes from our failure to be in the presence of God. So, do you ever come home from a long day of work, or maybe you've just had a lot of chores on a given day, or you took a hike, or it seems like you've been moving all day. And after dinner, you sit down, and it just hits you like a ton of bricks all at once. And you're like, whoa, I'm tired. I did not realize how exhausted I was until I stopped. I thought I had all this energy, but it turns out I don't. Does that resonate with people? I hope so. I can only see 4 of you, so I hope that resonates. I think prayer is kind of like that prayer doesn't make us restless, but prayer does expose a restlessness in us. It brings to the surface the fact that we have been so busy-hearted. And the remedy for that is not to just get done with prayer and move on to the next thing. The remedy for that is to be in the presence of the Father and to commune with the Father. And I think this is what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 11 when he says this. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus offers us rest for our souls. And rest for the soul is found in nothing other than being in the presence of God, being in fellowship with God. And so when Jesus says, I give you rest, what he's offering is fellowship and intimacy with the Father. And this is what the writer of Hebrews is talking about in chapter 10, starting in verse 19. It says, Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful.
That's my phone.
Jesus has opened for us a way of being in communion with God again, a way of being in fellowship with the Father through the Spirit. And it comes to us through his body, through the curtain that is his flesh, through his blood that's shed on the cross, and through the power of his resurrection. Now, there are 2 pieces to what I'm talking about. First, there's the salvation piece. There's the reality of our salvation. And thanks be to God that the reality of our salvation doesn't hinge on our feeling from day to day. That whether you are saved or not does not hinge on whether you feel saved on a particular day. There's the reality of it regardless of how we feel. But then the other piece is our actual experience. Do we experience rest? Are our hearts still unruly and restless? And it is possible to be saved and yet continue to have this lived experience of restlessness and unquiet in our souls that evokes this frenzy of activity. And so the question for us is, how can the reality of our salvation become our experience of rest and clarity? How can that become a practical reality in our daily life? Listen to what Dallas Willard says in his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines. We find ourselves caught on the horns of a dilemma. If one day I assure my Christian friends that I intend to quit sinning and follow Jesus perfectly, they will most likely be scandalized and threatened, or at least very puzzled. Who do you think you are? They would probably say. Or they might think, what is he up to? But if, on the other hand, I state that I do not intend to stop sinning, and that I do not plan even to follow my Lord in actuality. They will be equally upset, and for good reason. How can Jesus be my Lord if I don't even plan to obey him? Would that really differ in substance and outcome from not having him as my Lord at all? My Christian fellowship circle will not allow me not to follow him. My Christian circle will allow me not to follow him, and even plan not to follow him, but they will not permit me to say it. Yet I must do one or the other. Either I must intend to stop sinning or not intend to stop. So I guess the question is, what is your plan for growth? Do you plan to grow, or are you good where you are? Because remember, prayer is like this backwards bicycle, and it does take practice. It takes time. It takes commitment. I think I speak for a lot of us, not you personally, but for most of us, when I say that we're quite content with where we are in our spiritual walk. Because if we weren't content, we would have a plan for how we're going to move forward. And so the lack of a plan, that actually we're pretty okay with where we are. But on the other hand, we do have this picture of like where we would like to be, where we would have these disciplines of prayer and confession and fasting and spiritual retreat and community, all these in place. It's like we're okay with where we are and we would love to be there. It's just the middle that we don't want to do. It's been said about the art of writing that nobody wants to write, but everybody wants to have written. And I think it's the same way about prayer, that nobody wants to learn to pray, everybody wants to already know how to do it. But the problem is there's a road, the road between here and there is paved with prayer. And between here and there, we have to confront the inner chaos in us. The passage from Hebrews that I read a moment ago goes on to say, so let's consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, we're not neglecting to meet together, and I don't think anybody is accusing us of neglecting to meet together. But I think that we have now been underwater long enough that we're starting to really feel it. That we need each other, not just for somebody to talk to, not just for a friend, but that we need each other to stir each other on and to prod each other towards spiritual growth. Our spiritual formation is not on pause. It's never on pause. You didn't get a break from spiritual formation for however long we're in exile. But we need each other's help to deal with this inner chaos and to cultivate these habits of prayer. And so, this week, we're going to start a 6-week period where we're going to dig in on prayer. And it's not just going to be the sermons that are going to be about prayer, but I want us to try to cultivate a habit of prayer for the next 40 days. And so I'm calling this 40 Days of Prayer, which is both clever and original. So here's how this is going to work. Tomorrow is the first day of the 40 days. Tomorrow is day 1. This is day 0. I get an extra day if I do it that way. So tomorrow is day 1. And each day I'm asking you to do 3 things. And I think you can handle this. This isn't too much for you. First, we're going to say the Lord's Prayer in the morning and in the evening. When you get out of bed in the morning, when your feet hit the ground and you're still sitting in your bed, you say the Lord's Prayer. And at night, when you climb into bed, your feet are on the ground and you sit down, you say the Lord's Prayer. And if you don't know the Lord's Prayer, it is in Luke 11. It's also in Matthew 6. But that's the first thing. And I don't want you to just recite it. Initially, it's probably going to be just reciting it, but I want you to really think about the words that you're saying and try to appropriate them as your own prayers. So that's first. It's the Lord's Prayer to begin and end the day. Second, every day I'm going to be sending out an email that is going to have two passages, a psalm and a New Testament passage, and then probably 3 or 4 sentences that say something about a topic for the day. That today we're going to focus on praise. Today we're going to focus on confession. Today we're going to focus on the fact that God is king. Today we're going to think about this. And the passages will kind of go along with that. And so if you, by the way, if you're not on our email list, if you don't go to Poncha Springs Church of Christ and you want to participate in this, you're welcome to do that with us, but I need to know so that I can put you on the list. This will only take a few minutes. If you already have a larger habit of prayer, then this will be something you can incorporate into that. And if you don't already have a habit of prayer, then this will be a great starting place because it's just 3, 4, 5 minutes. And I think you can do that. That's manageable, especially if we're only doing it for 40 days. But hopefully it'll catch. So first is the Lord's Prayer to bookend the day. Second is this daily devotional. And then third is we're going to collect these prayer requests on Sunday, and then I send them out. As soon as we're done here, I go into my office and I type up an email and send you the prayer requests so that you have those to go over each day for the next 6 days. And then we'll come back the next week and get a new batch so that you have those to pray over. So 3 things: beginning and ending with the Lord's Prayer, the daily devotional, and then the Sunday list. I think that's manageable. I think you guys can do that. That's not a huge commitment, but I think it can have a big payoff as we try to reclaim this heritage of prayer that goes back to the days of Simeon being in the hospital.